They fed our sailors with pride, hope, and the barest scraps, and then we let those meals vanish like salt in the sea. What did we lose when the flavors that kept them alive were quietly erased from our kitchens? Salt pork and navy beans were the backbone of countless sailor diets, not because they were glamorous, but because they worked. The beans could be stored forever, and salt pork was basically meat dipped in time travel. It lasted through everything. Cooks would simmer the two together in giant pots, letting the salty fat soak into every soft little bean. The flavor was dense, greasy, and honest. There was something comforting about how simple it was. It did not matter if you were in a quiet port or facing the roughest waters on earth, this bowl grounded you. Some sailors would add a splash of vinegar, maybe a pinch of pepper, or a slice of stale bread to mop it up. It was not exciting, but it was dependable, like the sea itself. You do not see it anymore. Too salty, too plain, too real. Salt pork and navy beans did not survive the war of convenience food and changing tastes. Now it is just a memory, hiding in the pages of old Navy cookbooks, waiting for someone to bring it back. Hardtack was not food, it was a challenge. These dry, square biscuits were so hard they could break teeth. They were baked until rock solid, meant to last months, sometimes years, without spoiling. But sailors had their ways. They dipped hardtack into molasses, letting the sticky sweetness soften the corners. It was not dessert, but it was as close as most got. The biscuits were riddled with stories of weevils, chipped mugs, and midnight shifts. Molasses was the saving grace, coating every bite in something that reminded you of land and home. Sailors would gather around, break off pieces, and share in silence. Not much to say when your mouth is glued shut with history. Eventually, ships stopped carrying it. Fresher bread, canned goods, and better storage pushed hardtack into the past. You will not find it in any modern galley or even most homes. And yet, something about that molasses dip, that slow chew, feels more human than half the snacks we eat today. It was rough, stubborn, and unforgettable. Slumgullion stew was the culinary version of rolling with the punches. Sailors never knew exactly what they were going to get, but they knew it would be hot and filling. Ground beef, potatoes, onions, maybe a carrot or two. Whatever scraps the galley had lying around got tossed into the pot. The name alone tells you everything. Slumgullion. It sounded like something scraped off a boot, but it filled bellies in rough seas and colder nights. Some added ketchup for tang, some poured in a splash of coffee or beer. There was no single recipe. That was the point. It was the original mystery meat dinner. One pot, one fire, 20 men satisfied. When sailors got home, some kept making it for their families, cheap, quick, and easy. But over time, the name became a joke. The meal got replaced with frozen dinners, boxed noodles, and sauces with labels. Slumgullion disappeared not because it was bad, but because it reminded people of hard times. Funny how the most humble meals were the ones that held us together. Ship's biscuits and pea soup were not just food, they were survival. The biscuits were tough, dry, and almost flavorless, but they kept. The pea soup was thick and salty, boiled down to something close to paste. Together, they were a meal you could count on when the weather turned and the stores ran low. Sailors would dunk their biscuits in the soup, softening each bite into something edible. It was slow eating, but it slowed the mind too. You had time to think, to listen to the creak of the ship, the splash of waves, and the quiet hum of dozens of men doing the same thing. It was a ritual, a rhythm, one you do not hear anymore. Eventually, the soup got thinner, the biscuits softer, and the meaning faded. What was once a testament to patience and preparation is now just a footnote in old maritime logs. But in those quiet bites, there was resilience. Canned corned beef hash was the frying pan anthem of the high seas. Crack open the can, slap it into a hot skillet, and let it hiss and spit like a grumpy old sailor. The smell was unmistakable. Salty beef, starchy potatoes, and something metallic lurking underneath. It was not pretty. It was not even fully appetizing. But it was there. It gave protein, It gave texture. It gave you something to chew when the waves were too loud to talk over. Some galleys would throw in chopped onions or top it with a fried egg if they were feeling fancy. But even plain, it was enough. This was a meal that did not try to be more than it was. And maybe that is why it vanished. Too straightforward. Too canned. Too humble for an age that wants food to look like art. But sailors knew better. They knew that survival sometimes came with a side of silence and a can of hash. Creamed salmon on rice sounded fancy, but it was just canned fish in disguise. Sailors would open a tin of salmon, make a simple white sauce out of powdered milk and flour, and stir it all together. Poured over hot rice, it became a rich, salty blanket, warm, creamy, and surprisingly satisfying. It was a small luxury made from shelf-stable scraps. You could taste the ocean, sure, but also the war effort, the rationing, the need to make something feel like dinner. Some sprinkled parsley, others added peas. Every galley had its own version, but the feeling was the same. Comfort. On a ship full of rust, ropes, and routine, this was the closest thing to a hug on a plate, and then it disappeared. The rice got replaced with instant noodles. The canned salmon went ignored. The white sauce became a lost art. But somewhere, in a dusty recipe card box or a sailor's memory, that dish still simmers. Fried bologna and potatoes was a sizzling skillet symphony of salt, grease, and survival. Thick slabs of bologna would curl and crisp in a hot pan, their edges bubbling like tiny sails in the wind. Toss in some diced potatoes, maybe an onion if the cook was generous, and you had a meal that smelled like home and hardship all at once. It was cheap, it was fast. It did not pretend to be anything more. But on merchant ships and in dockside kitchens, it was a favorite. The bologna browned up like steak if you squinted hard enough. The potatoes soaked up the flavor and filled the belly. Together, they were a working man's breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner. Today, you would be hard-pressed to find anyone who still fries bologna without irony. The dish became a punchline, a relic of poor times and old sailors. But it deserves better. It fed people. It warmed them. It brought laughter to steel halls and silence to empty stomachs. Navy bean pie was the sailors' sweet surprise. Beans for dessert? It sounds like a joke now, but during the lean years it was genius. Leftover navy beans were mashed smooth and mixed with sugar, spices, eggs, and a touch of butter. Baked in a pie crust, it came out looking like pumpkin but tasting uniquely warm and nutty. On ships with limited supplies, cooks had to be clever. Sweetness was rare. This pie became a small, silent celebration on long journeys. Some added a sprinkle of nutmeg, others used molasses or honey instead of sugar. Every slice told a story of thrift, resourcefulness, and the need for comfort. When the war ended, so did the pie. It was too strange, too rooted in ration books and necessity. But those who remember it fondly. It is a dessert that makes you question why we forgot the joy of making do. Dried cod with egg sauce was not something you craved. It was something you respected. The cod came in slabs, stiff as a board, and packed in salt like a mummy. Sailors would soak it for hours, then flake it into pans of bubbling egg sauce made from powdered milk, butter, and flour. The result was creamy, salty, and hearty, an odd but comforting bite that clung to your ribs. It was protein on a plate, fuel for heavy work and heavy waves. You could eat it with boiled potatoes or stale bread. Either way, it stayed with you. Not everyone loved it, but it kept you going. Eventually, fresh fish replaced the salted kind, and egg sauce fell out of fashion. But dried cod with egg sauce was a dish born of necessity, one that never asked to be liked, only to be remembered. Rice and raisins in sweetened milk was the sailor's bedtime story in a bowl. Simple, sweet, and strangely moving, it took basic ingredients and turned them into something soft and kind. Cooks would simmer rice in water or powdered milk, stir in a handful of raisins, and finish it off with sugar. Warm and thick, it was the closest thing to dessert many sailors got. It smelled like patience. It tasted like forgiveness. and it made you feel, even for a minute, like you were not so far from home. Some added cinnamon, others used evaporated milk, but the feeling stayed the same: gentle, quiet, and good. Over time, the world moved on. Pudding came in plastic cups, sweetness came in boxes, and the sailor's pudding disappeared into history. But somewhere, the scent of that warm pot still lingers, waiting to remind someone what kindness used to taste like. Spam and cabbage stir wasn't meant to be fancy. It was about using what you had, and on a Navy ship, that often meant spam. Sliced thick and fried in its own fat until crispy at the edges, spam met shredded cabbage in a hot skillet, softened with a little water or vinegar to stretch the flavor. The cabbage soaked up all the salty richness while adding a soft, almost buttery texture. This wasn't a meal in the traditional sense. It was survival food turned into comfort through repetition. Sailors knew the sound of it sizzling, the sour hit of vinegar in the air, and the way the meat clung to the ribs. Wartime cooks made it with onions if they were lucky, maybe a sprinkle of black pepper if they were blessed. It was filling, cheap, and familiar, especially during long stretches in the Pacific. No one ever bragged about it, but no one turned it down either. You ate it with a slice of stale bread or by the spoonful straight from the pan. Spam and cabbage stir might not sound like much now, but back then, it was a hot meal in a cold sea, and that meant something. Johnny cakes were born out of need and carried across centuries by seafarers, settlers, and southern kitchens alike. Made from cornmeal, water, and salt, sometimes with a dash of milk or lard, they were simple griddle cakes that filled bellies without fuss. On Navy ships or during hard times, they were a staple. When the griddle was hot and the batter hit the iron, the scent alone signaled comfort. Eaten hot with a pat of salted butter or a smear of preserved jam, Johnny cakes softened the sting of ration life. They didn't need yeast, didn't need to rise, and they kept well in the galley. For sailors, they were portable and sturdy. They could be dunked in coffee, crumbled into soup, or just eaten plain. On cold mornings at sea, they were golden rounds of warmth. Some added a pinch of sugar, others a splash of buttermilk if they could find it, but always they tasted like home, whatever home meant to the man eating them. Forgotten by most today, Johnny cakes were once the backbone of shipboard breakfasts and a small, hot reminder that not every meal had to be miserable. Boiled salt beef with cabbage wasn't meant to be delicious. It was meant to last. Salt beef, heavily brined and packed tight in barrels, was standard fare for sailors since the days of tall ships. On World War II vessels, it was still there, although now paired with cabbage and carrots in an effort to stretch both taste and texture. The beef was tough, needing hours of simmering to soften. The salt alone could pucker a mouth if you didn't soak it first. But when boiled with vegetables, it became something vaguely resembling a stew. The cabbage soaked up the briny richness, and the carrots offered the only hint of sweetness. It wasn't elegant, but it was filling, and most importantly, it kept men fed across endless seas. Sometimes there was mustard on the side if a cook got creative. Other times, nothing more than a ladle and a tin tray. The taste might have been forgettable, but the meal wasn't. It stuck to you, the way wartime food often did, firm, unyielding, but dependable. In a world where freshness was a fantasy, boiled salt beef and cabbage was reality, hot, salty, and always just enough. Mutton stew with barley was thick, slow-cooked, and built from the tougher ends of the meat supply. Mutton, not lamb, but older sheep, was strong in flavor and not easily loved. But it was cheap, durable, and when simmered for hours with water, root vegetables, and pearled barley, it transformed into a dish that fed entire crews with warmth and weight. The barley gave it body, almost porridge-like at times, and helped fill the empty space in men's stomachs after long watches at sea. It was an old-world stew, brought over from British ships and adapted to American galleys when fresh meat was scarce. The smell alone could wake you up. Sometimes a cook would toss in onions, maybe even a bay leaf if they were lucky. Most of the time, it was just salt, fat, and thyme. Leftovers were thicker the next day, almost like a hash, served with hard bread or crackers. It was never a favorite, but it was always remembered. Mutton stew was a dish of necessity, endurance, and survival, wrapped in steam and served from dented ladles in steel-bottomed pots. Cold pickled beets and eggs offered a jolt of flavor in a world where most things tasted like tin. Vinegar was the star here, sharp, bracing, and oddly refreshing on a hot deck or in a humid mess hall. Hard-boiled eggs were peeled and dropped into beet-stained brine, turning them deep pink over time. The beets added sweetness and crunch, while the eggs took on that vinegary punch. It was a side dish, a snack, sometimes even a meal if supplies ran thin. It lasted forever, stored in jars or vats, requiring no heat and no fuss. Sailors would pull out an egg with fingers stained red, crack it open, and eat it cold. It was a break from the bland. It was bright, strange, and completely unforgettable. This was preservation at its best. No refrigeration, no spoilage, just acid and time doing their work. Beets and eggs weren't glamorous, but they were consistent. And in a world built on rationing, salt, and shelf-stable meats, that kind of tangy relief became the secret favorite of many a galley hand. Canned Vienna sausages in gravy were the kind of meal you didn't think too hard about. You just ate. Tiny pale cylinders packed tightly in brine, Vienna sausages were easy to open, easy to fry, and even easier to stretch. A bit of canned gravy, thick, gelatinous, and brown, turned them into a poor man's feast when poured over toast or rice. Navy cooks could whip up a tray of this in minutes. Sailors might not know what part of the animal they were eating, but they knew it would be hot, salty, and ready fast. The smell was unmistakable, processed meat with a whisper of smoke and tin. Sometimes you'd see a sprinkle of pepper or a chopped onion tossed in for flair, but most of the time, it was just sausage and sauce. It was cheap fuel in a time of strict rations, and it had a strangely comforting consistency. You could eat it half asleep or right off the tray with a fork. These little sausages weren't glamorous, but for some they were oddly beloved. A soft bite in a hard world. Oxtail soup with root vegetables didn't look like much, but it was the kind of soup that worked hard. Oxtail, full of bone and sinew, wasn't for the squeamish. But when simmered long enough, it broke down into a deeply rich broth that warmed the belly and stuck to your ribs. Navy cooks used it when they needed something hearty. Add in turnips, potatoes, or parsnips, whatever root veg was on hand, and you had a stew that felt almost luxurious, even if it came from scraps. The marrow melted into the broth, and the little bits of meat clinging to bone became tender and savory. It was a dish that made the most out of what others threw away. It took time, though. This wasn't fast food, it was patience in a pot, stirred with fatigue and hope. Served with hard bread or a few crackers, oxtail soup was how you fed 50 men with 5 tails. It was efficient, warming, and unforgettable in its own strange way. Even now, that broth brings back memories for the few who still remember it, steaming in battered galley pots. Sweet potato and apple mash was one of the rare bright spots on a ship's menu. Soft, sweet, and warm, it brought a little comfort to a world made mostly of beige food. The sweet potatoes were boiled down and mashed, blended with chunks of stewed apple, sometimes even a touch of brown sugar if the cook was feeling generous. It wasn't always served as dessert. Sometimes it just showed up next to salt pork or Spam, but it gave sailors a taste of something close to home. The apples added tartness, the potatoes richness. Together, they formed a soft and slightly sticky mash that warmed the heart, especially around the holidays. On southern shipping routes or in tropical supply lines, fresh sweet potatoes were more common, so this dish appeared more often than you'd think. It didn't take much effort, just a big pot and a heavy spoon. It was warm, comforting, and orange as a sunset on the open sea. For many men, it was a spoonful of memory in a bowl of monotony. Red flannel hash was colorful, crispy, and loud with flavor. A skillet-fried mix of corned beef, potatoes, onions, and beets, it got its name from the deep red tones that stained the pan and the plate. Navy men loved it in colder ports, where hot, greasy food warmed fingers and spirits. The beets bled into everything, turning even the potatoes pink. It was usually made with leftovers, corned beef from the night before, potatoes from who knows when, and canned beets that always seemed to be around. Fried until crispy, then flipped and fried again, it was the kind of dish that smelled like something better than it was. Some men loved it, others hated it, but no one forgot it. You ate it straight from the pan, preferably with a fried egg on top if the galley had any. It wasn't delicate, it wasn't refined, but it was honest. Red flannel hash was a meal that said, "We made it through the night, let's try and do it again." Creamed kippered herring might sound fancy, but on early Navy ships, it was just breakfast. Kippers, smoked, salty herring, were crumbled or flaked and folded into a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk. Poured hot over toast, it was fishy, smoky, creamy, and surprisingly filling. You'd smell it before you saw it. The sharpness of smoked herring cut through the morning fog in a mess hall like nothing else. It was old world, English-inspired, and used mostly when fresh meat was hard to come by. Some sailors grew to love it, especially those from the East Coast or Europe. Others avoided it unless absolutely starving. But it got the job done. High in protein, low in cost, and easy to make by the gallon. The toast helped soak up the sauce, and for a few minutes you could pretend you were back in a warm kitchen instead of a freezing ship's galley. It was strong, strange, and very much a product of its time. Today, it's almost vanished. But back then, it was how you started your day at sea, with smoke, salt, and steam. Boiled rice with prunes and cinnamon was dessert for the disciplined. It came in dented cans marked with military codes instead of names, and it arrived in supply crates bound for the open sea. When fresh fruit was a fantasy, prunes were the answer. Syrupy, sticky, and shelf-stable. The rice was boiled plain in salted water, then ladled into deep trays and covered with sweetened cinnamon syrup and chopped prunes. It was warm. It was filling. It made you forget, if only briefly, the cold metal walls and the smell of diesel. This was not dessert as we know it now. No whipped cream, no frosting, no crunch, just sugar, starch, and a whisper of spice. But after days of dried meat and cold beans, it tasted like a reward. Today, you rarely see this dish anywhere, unless you catch it in the faded pages of a vintage Navy cookbook. But some sailors still remember the taste. It was the sweetness you earned, not the kind you bought. Turnip and carrot mash with salt pork drippings was poor man's comfort. It was boiled, pounded, and laced with fat saved from the morning's pan. There was no butter, no cream, just roots, salt, and whatever heat the galley stove could muster. The salt pork came first, crisped in a skillet, its fat caught and poured over the steaming mash. This was food made by necessity, not invention, and yet it stuck to your ribs and made you feel human after long hours on deck or down in the engine room. The taste was earthy, humble, and quietly rich, the sweetness of carrots meeting the bitterness of turnips. When meat was scarce or spoiled, this dish carried the day. It filled plates and silenced complaints. Over time, it faded, too bland, too humble for modern kitchens. But sailors knew its power. It was food that felt honest. It reminded them of their mothers, their farms, and the empty tables they left behind. It was never fancy, but it was always enough. Canned sardines on hard bread was the sailors' no-nonsense snack. A flat tin opened with a hiss, the fish inside glistening with oil, sometimes mustard, sometimes tomato sauce. Hard bread, dry, unbending, built to survive storms, was the only plate you needed. You laid the sardines out with your fingers. No forks, no ceremony, just you, the fish, and the sea. On smaller ships and supply vessels, when hot meals were a luxury, this snack became lunch or dinner, or both. It was full of protein, full of salt, full of the taste of hard days and harder nights. The bread never crumbled. It cracked. It dared you to bite it. Most would not call this a meal today. It has vanished into the corners of survival kits and novelty snack aisles. But once, it was sustenance on the move. It was food that never spoiled, never asked for storage, and never let you down. Cold, briny, and unglamorous, it was what you ate when no one was watching. Beef heart stew with potatoes was the quiet hero of the ship's galley. No one asked for it, no one bragged about it. But when it hit the tray, steaming and thick, it never came back untouched. Organ meats were cheap, beef hearts were durable, protein-rich, and tender if you cooked them long enough. You chopped them into chunks, browned them in a greasy skillet, and simmered them with onion, potatoes, and black pepper until they surrendered. The stew had weight. It was food that felt solid. You ate it with bread or just your spoon. Some sailors never knew it was heart. They thought it was just beef. The secret stayed with the cooks, and maybe that was for the best. Today, beef heart is rare in kitchens, rarer still in restaurants. But for those who knew hunger, it was gold. You did not waste meat just because it beat once. You honored it by making it last. It was the heart of the meal, literally. Herring roe scramble was rich in ways most people cannot imagine now. The tiny eggs were packed with nutrients, pulled from the fish, and turned into breakfast by necessity more than choice. Cooks sautéed onions in pork fat, added the roe, and cracked in eggs. It turned into a soft, glistening mix that shimmered on the plate like caviar's older, humbler cousin. To some, it looked unappetizing. To sailors, it was a blessing. It kept you full for hours and used every part of the fish. This was no omelet. This was survival wrapped in salt. Sometimes the taste was metallic. Sometimes it was buttery. It always depended on how fresh the roe was and how tired the cook had become. Over time, the roe scramble disappeared. Too unfamiliar, too delicate for shelf life. But sailors once swore by it. It gave them strength. It tasted of ocean and ash. And it reminded them that nothing, not even the tiniest egg, should go to waste at sea. Baked Navy macaroni with dried cheese powder was the Navy's answer to comfort. The macaroni came in bulk, hard elbows in heavy sacks. The cheese was a powder, bright orange, and stored in metal tins. No milk, no butter, just hot water and whatever the ship's cook could whip into a sauce. Sometimes they baked it. Sometimes they just stirred it over the stove until it thickened. It was bland, salty, and oddly satisfying. On a long voyage, it felt like a treat. It was warm. It was cheesy, at least in name. You could eat it quickly, standing up or while writing letters home. It stuck to the ribs and kept you going through night shifts and stormy mornings. Today, people know boxed macaroni, but this version was its gritty ancestor. No creamy topping, no golden crust, just elbow macaroni and cheese that came from a scoop, not a cow. But for sailors, it meant normalcy, a taste of something almost homemade. Almost. Split cornbread and onion gravy was what you made when rations ran dry. Cornbread was baked in slabs, often dry and crumbly from lack of eggs or milk. Onion gravy was made from browned onions, flour, water, and fat saved from the last bit of meat, if you had any. You tore the cornbread with your hands, poured the gravy hot over the top, and let it soak. If you're looking for a dignified meal, then you have to look somewhere else. This one's only for those who are willing to get their hands dirty. It was soft, it was salty, it was humble, but it tasted like effort. Like the galley cook still cared, even on a rationed Thursday after 3 weeks at sea. Sailors came to love it, especially when meat was gone and beans had worn out their welcome. The sweetness of the cornbread and the sharpness of the onions made it strangely comforting. Today, you will not find it in any cookbook. It is not fancy, it is not photogenic, but once it was the dish that reminded sailors they were still human, and that someone, somewhere, wanted them to feel full. Minced mutton on toast was a relic even then. You took yesterday's mutton, chewy, dry, nearly useless, and gave it one more life. Chopped fine, cooked down in broth, and seasoned with whatever was left in the galley tin. It was poured hot over stale bread or toast, sometimes topped with mustard or a splash of vinegar. It was strong, savory, and hard to forget. Mutton was cheaper than beef, lasted longer, and had a flavor that did not need much help. On long voyages, that mattered. Meals that gave the sailor in you all the spunk you needed to survive your long journey, hopefully with minimal motion sickness. After all, nobody likes puking over deck on their first day on the scene. You needed meals that could hold their shape and soul through 100 miles of rough water. Sailors ate it in silence. They did not always like it, but it was honest food, made from what was there, not what was wished for. It faded fast in civilian kitchens after the war. Too tough, too gamey, too old-fashioned. But for sailors, it meant stability. A hot plate, a full stomach, and one more night made easier by salt and steam. Fish chowder with evaporated milk was warmth in a tin bowl. White fish, often cod or haddock, chopped rough and simmered with potatoes and onions in broth. Then came the evaporated milk, thick, shelf-stable, and poured in until the broth turned creamy. No cream, no butter, no fresh milk. Just the can, the ladle, and the stove. The chowder was peppery, briny, and filled with chunks. It reminded some sailors of home, others of what they were missing. You could eat it with hard bread or straight from the bowl. It was served in rough seas and calm harbors alike, steady and soothing. The milk dulled the salt. The fish made you feel full. Today, it feels like a lost cousin to New England chowder, but it was leaner, harsher, more practical. It did not aim to impress. It aimed to restore. And it did. It brought warmth to cold decks, comfort to sleepless nights, and taste to a world stripped down to its essentials. Some men added broken biscuits, others stirred in dried herbs or flakes of hot pepper from a care package. When it was hot, it chased away the wet chill that never seemed to leave. When it was cold, it was still better than going without. You could smell it across the mess line, savory and faintly metallic. And in that moment, even just for 10 minutes, a bowl of chowder made the ocean feel a little less wide. The tasty meat pie isn't your average store-bought pie. We're talking about a savory masterpiece filled with delicious goodness. This used to be a classic at Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners back in the day before hash brown casseroles came to take the cake. But tasty meat pies had their own beauty. Imagine a flaky golden brown crust with a filling of seasoned ground meat, chopped vegetables like carrots and peas, and a rich, flavorful gravy. The origins of the meat pie have been traced back to the Neolithic period around 6000 BC. Yeah, even the Egyptians were a fan of this classic. It's perfect for a potluck, a family dinner, or even a cozy night in. The best part? Its portability. Just grab a slice and head out the door. It's the ultimate dinner on the go. Now, Swiss steak is like a warm hug from the past. This dish is all about slow-cooked, fall-apart tender beef bathed in a tangy tomato sauce. Think slow cooker vibes, but way before slow cookers were even a thing. Now, the Swiss steak is all about patience. The longer you simmer the beef, the more melt in your mouth delicious it becomes. It's also the perfect way to use up that tougher cut of meat you accidentally grabbed at the store. If you grew up thinking this dish was from Switzerland, as the name suggests, now would be a good time for me to tell you your whole life was a lie. This technique of cooking up tender meat came from England, so they're the ones to thank for this meaty goodness. I can just imagine the satisfying experience of cutting through that tender beef with minimal effort. Swiss steak, a dinnertime classic that deserves a comeback. Where do I sign the petition? Few dishes command attention quite like a well-prepared crown roast. Traditionally served at homecoming dinners and holiday gatherings, it was the kind of dish that made guests stop and admire before the first bite. The ring of bone-in pork chops, arranged in a regal circle, was as much about presentation as it was about flavor. For families looking to impress without breaking the bank, the pork crown roast was a surprisingly economical choice. Pork was, and still is, one of the most affordable meats, and butchers often offered deals on bulk cuts. The apricot glaze, a key feature of this recipe, added just the right balance of sweetness and depth, while a bread-based stuffing packed the center for an even heartier meal. Preparing this dish took skill and patience. The roast had to be properly Frenched, tied, and slow-cooked to achieve that juicy, tender texture. But for many home cooks, The challenge was worth the reward. Unfortunately, as home butchering became a lost art and families shifted toward convenience meals, the crown roast started to disappear from dinner tables. This creamy, savory casserole, ham tetrazzini with egg noodles, showcases how a few simple ingredients can be transformed into something truly special. While turkey tetrazzini is more commonly known, ham tetrazzini became a popular variation, especially for using up leftover holiday ham in a way that felt both indulgent and comforting. Named after Italian opera singer Luisa Tetrazzini, this dish originally featured chicken or turkey, often paired with a creamy sauce, mushrooms, and a variety of seasonings. The exact origin of ham tetrazzini is unclear, but the combination of a rich, buttery sauce and tender ham makes it a favorite for families seeking a hearty, filling meal. Egg noodles, thanks to their soft texture and ability to absorb sauces, are the perfect base for this casserole. When tossed with the ham and creamy sauce, they turn into a flavorful foundation that holds everything together. A sprinkle of Parmesan cheese on top before baking creates a golden, bubbly crust that takes the dish to another level. So we're going to go up to the upper class side of things for a bit. This wasn't a dish that anyone else could have afforded to make or eat back then anyway. Homemade gnocchi with noodles was still something that the relatively well-off and affluent families in the States were able to eat, and it was entirely something limited to certain parts of big urban hubs like Chicago, New York, and Washington. Gnocchi is an Italian dish, which I'm sure you already know. What's interesting is that it actually came on over to the States thanks to Italian immigrants, and back then, it hadn't become the fine dining appetizer that it's known to be today. It wasn't exactly that pricey either. Back then, Italian communities full of immigrants were still making it whenever they could. For the gnocchi, all you would need is flour, water, and dough. These were things that were out of the reach of normal people, sure, but to people with generational wealth? Well, it was mostly business as usual. Don't get me wrong, even though they were impacted by the recession and the Dust Bowl, there wasn't a single American home that wasn't. Did they draw the short end of the stick, though? Not by a long shot. This wasn't a dish you'd see anywhere outside of real bougie neighborhoods. The tasty meat pie isn't your average store-bought pie. We're talking about a savory masterpiece filled with delicious goodness. This used to be a classic at Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners back in the day before hash brown casseroles came to take the cake. But tasty meat pies had their own beauty. Imagine a flaky, golden brown crust with a filling of seasoned ground meat, chopped vegetables like carrots and peas, and a rich, flavorful gravy. The origins of the meat pie have been traced back to the Neolithic period, around 6000 BC. Yeah, even the Egyptians were a fan of this classic. It's perfect for a potluck, a family dinner, or even a cozy night in. The best part? Its portability. Just grab a slice and head out the door. It's the ultimate dinner on the go. So if you go on over to the African American community during this time, especially in the rural South, then you'll find that a lot of them were introducing Americans to something new. Black-eyed peas and collard greens were a traditional pairing that was passed down in their community for ages, and it really pulled its weight for everyone throughout the Depression. Before all this mess had started, people weren't really too aware about the benefits of a black-eyed pea or how easy it was to grow. In fact, beyond navy and pinto beans, the average American didn't really think about what else was out there. Maybe the occasional split pea, but that's it. Collard greens still had a lot more of a reputation for being a super healthy dish you should always be eating. But it was hard to get the kids onto that kind of food. The hunger that most people would experience would push people out of their bubbles and have them eating anything available, though. Black-eyed peas were still one of the easiest things to grow, and it was especially popular throughout African American communities, even more so than usual. They had always made a lot of these, but now they were living by it too. With roots in Southern cooking, smothered chicken with onions and gravy is the perfect blend of crispy chicken, tender onions, and rich gravy that makes you want to go back for seconds, and maybe even thirds. Smothering food, whether it's chicken, pork chops, or beef, is an iconic Southern technique. The term smothered refers to cooking the meat slowly in its own juices or a flavorful sauce, often with onions or bell peppers, until it's tender and full of flavor. For this dish, the chicken is first browned to achieve a crispy golden skin before being smothered in sautéed onions and a gravy made from pan drippings. The result is a plate of food that's pure comfort. Gravy, of course, is the magic behind smothered chicken. Made from the fond left in the pan after frying, it's rich and savory, sometimes thickened with flour or cornstarch and seasoned to perfection. And those onions caramelize beautifully, adding sweetness and depth to every bite. Smothered chicken is like a hug on a plate, if that hug could also be crispy and covered in gravy. It's a dish that brings people to the table, no matter the occasion. For decades, stuffed bell peppers were a staple of the American dinner table. They were practical, inexpensive, and packed with flavor. Families in the mid-20th century relied on simple, hearty meals, and this dish delivered. With just a few basic ingredients, ground beef, rice, tomatoes, and a well-seasoned filling, home cooks could create a meal that was both satisfying and visually appealing. Peppers were an accessible ingredient, easy to grow in backyard gardens and cheap at the store. Their natural shape made them the perfect edible container, eliminating the need for extra cookware. The filling, often stretched with rice to make the meat go further, was an economical way to feed a large family on a budget. Baked until tender, the peppers absorbed the savory juices, creating a dish that was both rustic and comforting. But as convenience foods took over, stuffed peppers began to fade from dinner rotations. The rise of prepackaged meals and fast food options meant fewer people were willing to spend time hollowing out peppers and slow baking a homemade filling. Today, the dish still makes an occasional appearance in nostalgic cookbooks, but it's no longer a household staple. Lamb might seem like a fancy restaurant thing these days, but back in the day, it was a total dinnertime MVP. Lamb stew was a fan favorite at dinner parties back in the day, and I get the hype. Imagine the combination of melt-in-your-mouth lamb and an assortment of colorful vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and peas simmered in a rich, flavorful broth just begging to be soaked with some crusty bread. This is a dish that's guaranteed to warm you up from the inside out on a chilly day. Not to mention, it's surprisingly easy to make. Perfect for those nights when you want a delicious meal without spending hours in the kitchen. Just maybe don't tell your grandma you added a sprinkle of your favorite hot sauce. Some traditions are best left untouched. Once a staple of dinner parties and homecoming feasts, this elegant yet simple side dish was a favorite among home cooks looking to add a touch of sophistication to their meals. Crisp, tender green beans, lightly sautéed in butter and finished with toasted almonds, struck the perfect balance between freshness and richness. Green beans were one of the most accessible vegetables in American kitchens. Whether fresh, frozen, or canned, they were affordable and widely available year-round. Almonds, though slightly more expensive, were used sparingly, adding a crunchy contrast without overwhelming the dish. The preparation was straightforward. The beans were quickly blanched to preserve their bright color and firm texture, then tossed in a buttery skillet with slivered almonds for a nutty, golden brown finish. Some recipes included a squeeze of lemon or a sprinkle of garlic for extra depth. But as convenience cooking took hold, green bean almondine slowly faded from dinner tables. Canned green bean casseroles, loaded with processed ingredients, became the new standard, and simple, fresh preparations were overlooked in favor of heavier, creamier alternatives. So, the cabbage was really similar. Basically, during the Dust Bowl, it was mostly a competition of how fast you could grow something and how conveniently you could do it. People weren't bothering with anything that took more effort than it was worth or didn't give immediate results. And honestly, I completely get them. Why would you waste your time on crops that are inherently difficult to grow when even the easy ones are going through so much crop failure? Cabbage was one of those easy-to-grow plants, and it became a national savior for lots of people. Cabbage stir-fry with onions and garlic was something people could enjoy every other day, as most of the core ingredients were things they had already been growing in their backyard gardens or preserving for a long while. At this point, the average American person is still used to keeping their experience with cabbage to just burgers, but the Dust Bowl pushed everyone out of their comfort zone just for the sake of survival. Hear me out, this one might sound a little boring at first glance. but trust me, it's a classic for a reason. The split pea soup is a hearty, filling, and surprisingly healthy-ish, thick, creamy soup packed with vibrant green split peas and other vegetables like carrots, celery, and onions. Now, on that healthy-ish claim, it depends on how much butter and cream your grandma used. The split pea soup is the kind of soup that leaves you feeling satisfied for hours. It has been a St. Patrick's Day staple ever since its origin in 1905. The best part? You can totally customize it according to your liking. Yeah, don't be shy to throw in your favorite veggies, add a splash of lemon juice for a bit of brightness, or even some leftover shredded chicken for an extra protein punch. We really need to bring this one back. The Dust Bowl was hardship personified. Things like lentil and kale stew were honestly very necessary for the overall survival of people. Hearty greens like that would last, could resist the extreme weather and environment, and were most of all really nutritious. This was a time where you wanted to eat just about anything that strengthened your immune system. It wasn't just the lack of good food that was making it easier for people to get sick, it was also the lack of access to health care. People couldn't afford doctors, and the worst of the Dust Bowl hit all of the slums and rural areas that occupy the outskirts of so many states. This meant that a lot of lower and working class people regularly just ate so that the chances of getting sick were less and less, though despite their best efforts, they would eventually fall sick as well. Lentil and kale stew is as super as a food can get, and I mean that in every sense, but it's not an end-all be-all. What it is, though, is a very hearty stew that works great around the winter months for an entire family. You could spin this around a few different ways for variety, and it would still work, but the kids definitely had a tough time getting used to something like this. Can't really blame them either. I'm an adult, and I still struggle with kale. A staple of potlucks, homecoming dinners, and weeknight meals, this creamy, cheesy bake was the ultimate comfort food. With its simple ingredients and easy preparation, cheddar broccoli rice bake became a go-to for busy home cooks looking to feed a crowd on a budget. Rice was one of the most affordable pantry staples, stretching meals and adding heartiness without costing much. Broccoli, whether fresh or frozen, provided a touch of green and a hint of nutrition. But the real star was the cheese sauce, a rich, velvety mixture made with cheddar, milk, and often a can of condensed soup for convenience. Some variations added a crunchy topping like buttered breadcrumbs or crushed crackers for an extra layer of texture. This dish thrived in the 1970s and 80s when casseroles dominated American kitchens. But as fresh vegetables and from-scratch cooking made a comeback, cream-based bakes fell out of favor. The rise of quick, microwavable sides also played a role. Why spend time layering and baking when a bag of steamed broccoli and instant rice could be ready in minutes? For those who grew up with its bubbling, cheesy goodness straight from the oven, this classic deserves a second look. No dish says Sunday dinner like a pot roast simmering away, filling the house with the unmistakable aroma of comfort. Pot roast was an event, the centerpiece of countless family gatherings. Originating in France, pot au feu inspired what we now call pot roast, combining tougher cuts of beef with slow cooking to create something tender and flavorful. In America, the pot roast became a household favorite thanks to its practicality. Chuck roast, brisket, or round, these cuts weren't fancy, but with the magic of a Dutch oven or slow cooker, they transformed into melt-in-your-mouth perfection. Carrots, potatoes, and onions balanced the rich beef with earthy sweetness and hearty texture. The beauty of pot roast is its patience. It doesn't demand attention, just time. It's a dish that rewards you for slowing down, a rarity in today's grab-and-go world. As one home cook joked, it's the only dish that cooks itself while you're watching Sunday football. And we shall not forget the gravy, a pot roast's crowning glory. Thickened with pan drippings, it's the glue that holds this masterpiece together. If love had a flavor, pot roast might just be it. Similarly enough, people were having a lot of fun with all the different things you could do with celery. You could braise your celery with potatoes to have something resembling a home-cooked meal. It would often work too. Your knowledge of the Dust Bowl may be about its ecological extremes, though. I mean, it felt like that little chunk of the planet was throwing a generational hissy fit. What people did to cope with the trifecta of war, economic breakdown, and ecological disaster was a lot more interesting, at least to me, and hopefully to you too. Do you remember how I keep mentioning those backyard gardens people had? They were known as victory gardens, and the basic idea was to basically begin farming and planting crops on whatever fertile soil you had. Since potatoes were such an easy crop to grow, and since they could last in almost every kind of environment, it became really common for people to grow potatoes along with celery in these gardens. The end result was always a dish like braised celery and potatoes or mashed potatoes alongside celery, or a stew or broth. It was pretty efficient, and it would also double as trade for people, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in the next potato-based item. The Hungarians really killed it with dinners that shaped our childhood, because we've got another banger on the list. Hungarian goulash was everyone's favorite cozy hearty meal back in the day. Goulash is a hearty stew whipped up with tender chunks of beef simmered in a rich, savory sauce brimming with paprika. Yeah, paprika was huge back in the day. So why did this delicious dinner vanish from our dinner tables? Well, the Hungarian goulash traces back as far as the 10th century to stews eaten by the shepherds, so you can say this one might just have run its course. But hey, if you're ever craving goulash, dust off some old cookbooks and get to work, because it really isn't hard to wump up. This is the perfect dish for a chilly night in, curled up on the couch with a good movie. Just be careful not to spill it on your mom's vintage tablecloth. Those things are irreplaceable. Some of the best dishes come from necessity, and few ingredients are as dependable as potatoes. For generations, scalloped potatoes were a staple at homecoming dinners, potlucks, and Sunday feasts. Thinly sliced and baked in a rich, velvety sauce, they were a testament to the idea that simple ingredients, when treated right, could feel downright luxurious. Potatoes were the backbone of many American kitchens. They were cheap, easy to store, and could feed an entire family without much effort. The addition of a creamy sauce, made from milk, butter, and a touch of garlic, elevated this humble dish into something special. Some versions kept it simple, while others included layers of cheese, turning it into a gooey, golden masterpiece. Either way, it was a comforting, belly-filling side that paired well with just about any main course. The cooking process required patience. Proper scalloped potatoes weren't rushed. Each layer had to absorb the sauce, and the top needed time to develop that perfect golden crust. But as boxed potato mixes and instant gratins took over, homemade scalloped potatoes started to fade from dinner tables. Roast chicken with stuffing and green beans is a meal that evokes family gatherings, holidays, and a sense of home. This classic dinner has long been a centerpiece of American dining, combining practicality with elegance. Roasting chicken is one of the oldest cooking methods, but by the 20th century, it became a weekly tradition for many households. Chickens were relatively inexpensive, easy to prepare, and, if seasoned and roasted just right, deliciously satisfying. The key to a perfect roast chicken lies in the balance: crispy, golden skin on the outside and juicy, flavorful meat inside. Stuffing or dressing, depending on your regional preference, traces back to ancient Rome. By the time it reached American kitchens, cooks used bread cubes, herbs, and sometimes vegetables to create the savory, aromatic side we know today. While traditionally cooked inside the bird, many began baking it separately for a crispier texture, what some might call progress. Green beans complete this trio, often sautéed with garlic, almonds, or a touch of bacon. They brought a fresh, vibrant contrast to the richness of the chicken and stuffing. If you roast a chicken and make stuffing, you're not just making dinner, you're making memories. And for anyone who's ever had the leftovers, the memories taste just as good the next day. There was a time when Sunday dinner wasn't complete without a plate of slow-cooked, gravy-drenched pork chops. Smothered in rich, savory onion gravy and served alongside a heaping portion of mashed potatoes, this dish was a cornerstone of Southern home cooking. It was an experience, one that filled the kitchen with the unmistakable aroma of comfort. Pork was an affordable alternative to beef, making it a practical choice for families looking to stretch their grocery budget. Bone-in chops were particularly popular, as they were both flavorful and inexpensive. The slow cooking process allowed even the toughest cuts to become fork tender, absorbing the deep, savory notes of the seasoned gravy. Some cooks swore by a cast-iron skillet, while others let the dish simmer in a slow cooker for hours, ensuring the pork melted in your mouth. But as convenience foods and boneless, skinless meats took over the supermarket, this dish began to disappear. Quick-fix dinners replaced slow-simmered meals, and thick homemade gravies gave way to powdered mixes and canned alternatives. Today, smothered pork chops are a rare sight at the dinner table, but for those who remember the first bite of a perfectly tender chop covered in rich, peppery gravy, it's a dish worth revisiting. Lamb might seem like a fancy restaurant thing these days, but back in the day, it was a total dinnertime MVP. Lamb stew was a fan favorite at dinner parties back in the day, and I get the hype. Imagine the combination of melt-in-your-mouth lamb and an assortment of colorful vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and peas simmered in a rich, flavorful broth just begging to be soaked with some crusty bread. This is a dish that's guaranteed to warm you up from the inside out on a chilly day. Not to mention, it's surprisingly easy to make. Perfect for those nights when you want a delicious meal without spending hours in the kitchen. Just maybe don't tell your grandma you added a sprinkle of your favorite hot sauce. Some traditions are best left untouched. For families stretching their grocery budget, few meals delivered as much flavor and comfort as these unusual-looking meatballs. A product of the Great Depression and wartime rationing, porcupine meatballs were a creative way to make ground beef go further. Mixing rice into the meat wasn't just for texture. It bulked up the meal, making a pound of beef feed more mouths. Rice was an affordable pantry staple, and when the meatballs simmered in a tangy tomato sauce, the grains softened and expanded, giving them their signature spiky appearance. Despite the name, no porcupines were harmed in the making of this dish. Just a bit of kitchen ingenuity at work. Some recipes used canned tomato soup for a mild, creamy sauce, while others relied on crushed tomatoes and Worcestershire sauce for a sharper kick. Either way, the slow cooking process allowed the flavors to meld into a hearty, stick-to-your-ribs meal. For decades, this dish was a go-to for busy home cooks. It was easy, required minimal ingredients, and could be made in one pot, ideal for feeding a growing family. But as convenience foods and pre-made meatballs filled grocery store freezers, the homemade version started to disappear. Tamale pie is an American dish that brings together the heartiness of ground beef, the comfort of a cornmeal topping, and a blend of savory seasonings that make it a family favorite. While the name might suggest a traditional tamale, tamale pie is actually a casserole that layers these ingredients for a meal that's both satisfying and easy to make. The dish likely has its roots in the Southwest, where tamales have been a staple in Mexican cuisine for centuries. However, tamale pie emerged in the United States in the mid-20th century as a more accessible version, taking the flavors of tamales and turning them into a bake. Ground beef is browned with onions, garlic, and chili powder, then topped with a cornmeal batter and baked until golden. The result is a savory pie with a cornmeal crust that mimics the texture of a tamale. Tamale pie quickly became a favorite for home cooks thanks to its simplicity and versatility. It could be customized with ingredients like cheese, olives, or even jalapenos to suit personal tastes. Some families served it with a side of cornbread or a dollop of sour cream for extra richness. Tamale pie is proof that you don't need a fancy tamale press to make a meal that's full of flavor. Simple, hearty, and always a crowd pleaser. Green tomatoes were something people ate really regularly. It was tough to grow much else thanks to all the havoc the Dust Bowl was causing on the environment, and by 1936, it was already a period of long-lasting drought and dust storms. Not exactly the kind of surroundings that inspire a lot of vegetable growth. People regularly were dealing with crop failure, and it meant that lots of families had their sources of food and livelihoods cut off from them. Green tomatoes, on the other hand, were one of the few vegetables that people had no issues growing. That's why they got as popular as they did, because eventually, people would begin to hoard them. You'd make basic things out of them like fried green tomatoes with cornmeal coating, but it was enough to last you through the day. Ripe tomatoes were in even shorter supply, and what was available was either rationed or taken up by people in urban centers. It was quite hard for any lasting stock of vegetables to reach people in rural areas, and it was often those people who had it the worst during the Dust Bowl. So chicken paprikash is a Hungarian dish that sounds fancy, but is basically a party in a pot for your taste buds. Imagine juicy chicken pieces slow-cooked with tender onions in a creamy sauce bursting with the warm, smoky flavor of paprika. It's served with a side of fluffy rice or noodles. Chicken paprikash really found its footing back when Chinese takeout wasn't as big of a thing. You know, back when Grandma used to put on the apron and cook for us? This dish really was the one-pot wonder. Bonus points. If your grandma used to whip this up for you, that nostalgia factor is real. A version of it still exists in Bulgarian cuisine in case you crave the it now. The Bulgarians are a little light on the paprika and center the dish on sautéed onions. Okay, creamed spinach and pearl onions didn't look the most appetizing, but trust me, it was always a hit at family dinners. Think of a rich, creamy base packed with vibrant green spinach leaves. And let's not forget the star of the show, pearl onions, that added the perfect touch of sweetness. Not only was this dinner finger-licking delicious, but it was healthy too. Jam-packed with nutrients including vitamins A, C, and K, iron, folate, potassium, and a good amount of fiber. Just don't blame me if you get flashbacks to your school cafeteria. But hey, sometimes those cafeteria classics deserve a second chance, especially when they're this delicious and healthy all at the same time. If this voyage stirred up curiosity, toss us a like and comment down below. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the past.